Hello, my name is Tom Pettit, and welcome to this episode of Getting to Know Them. In this episode, I am excited to share with you the details and the stories pertaining to the Willie Handcart Company. And the Willie Handcart Company was an ill-fated handcart company. Their story is one of tragedy, but also one of triumph and miracles. I am excited to share with you the details, the historical facts of the Willie Handcart Company. But more importantly than that, I'm excited to share with you the personal stories of these individuals and the demonstration of faith in the Lord Jesus Christ that they had during their times of greatest trial. Now, we often, as church members, associate the Willie Handcart Company with the Martin Handcart Company. It's because they were traveling nearly the same at the same time, but they both suffered those same tragedies, but also those same triumphs as well. But in reality, the Willie Handcart Company and the Martin Handcart Company were never really together. They were always separated, sometimes by a few days, sometimes by many days, sometimes by a few miles, sometimes by nearly 100 miles. And so in this video, I'm going to focus exclusively on the Willie Handcart Company and save the story of the Martin Handcart Company for a different video. I went out to the plains of Wyoming. In fact, I went all the way back to Iowa, where the Willie Handcart Company really started to take form and shape under the direction of Captain Willie. And I walked so many of the miles of those trails, and I was anxious to tell you the stories right there from the trail and from the significant geographical locations where so many significant things happened with this company. And as I went out there, I was taking pictures and taking videos, but I realized and found out that my microphone wouldn't work. The reason being is it was November and it was freezing cold. And I guess that my microphone doesn't work when it gets to extreme temperatures. When I went out there, the wind chill made it about negative 20 degrees. It was really, really cold. And although I didn't have to deal with snow, the temperature gave me a little bit of a feeling of what these poor saints had to go through as they also had to face those bone-chilling winds in Wyoming. Part of the story that we'll get to later in the video, but despite me not being able to tell the story from the location, I've got pictures of all the locations that I will be showing to you. This first one here, that's the trail, the trail. That's the Mormon Pioneer Trail behind me that you can see. The ruts still visible in the ground from where hundreds and even thousands of handcarts and wagons were pulled. So many thousands of members of the church came and walked on the trail right here. And their mark is still visible to this day. This is just one of many of the pictures and videos that I'm going to show you of where the Willie Handcart Company was when particular events took place. Before I get into the Willie Handcart Company story and the story of the individuals that made up that company, I'd like to share with you a quote from President Hinckley. In referring to the pioneers and us remembering them, he offers purpose for remembering those saints and also promises while we remember those saints as well. He says, "It is good to look to the past to gain appreciation for the present and perspective for the future. It is good to look upon the virtues of those who have gone before to gain strength for whatever lies ahead. It is good to reflect upon the work of those who labored so hard and gained so little in this world, but out of whose dreams and early pains, so well nurtured, has come a great harvest, of which we are the beneficiaries. Their tremendous example can become a compelling motivation for all of us." So why handcarts, though? So many of the pioneers came by covered wagons that were drawn by oxen. That would be the preferred way because it's less physically taxing on an individual and you're able to take more stuff with you. But these individuals, these good saints, then living in England, faced a big dilemma, and that was their personal finances. They couldn't afford a covered wagon and oxen. They would save for years, still not being able to save enough to purchase the oxen and a covered wagon. Brigham Young knew of this situation and the saints' desperate desire to come to Zion. And so Brigham Young had set up what was called a perpetual immigration fund. This fund would be funded by the church, pay the passage and the immigration expenses of these saints. And then when these saints arrived in Utah, they would become employed. And the idea is that they would pay back the immigration fund so that somebody else can use those monies to make their way to Zion as well. Well, that was a wonderful idea, and it worked for the most part. But by the time the 1850s came around, the immigration fund was starting to dry up. There wasn't enough funds there to meet the demand of all the saints in England that were desiring to come to Utah. So Brigham Young, he prayed. And by revelation, it was given to him this handcart system. The handcart system would cost a fraction of what a wagon and oxen would require. Handcarts, or the wagons and oxen, would cost over $300. The handcart, about $8. This was exciting. It was thrilling to the saints in England. Now a way was possible for them to make their way to Zion. Brigham Young also promised not only would this be much, much less expensive, but it will be faster. These saints will be able to walk faster to Zion than the saints than they would otherwise get there by sitting in a wagon being drawn by slow walking oxen. It would also be easier. These saints wouldn't have to, it wouldn't be necessary for them to take care of the oxen and make sure that they're well fed and down for the night to rest and up again early in the morning to get hitched up and whatnot. And so it was much more efficient to be able to just pull off this trail, camp for the night, and then get up and start walking once again. Brigham Young also made the prophecy, and it came true, with the exception of the Willie and Martin Handcart companies. But for those other 8 handcart companies, this prophecy came true, in which Brigham Young promised that the saints would run into the Salt Lake Valley, because every day of walking along the trail pulling their handcart, they would become stronger and stronger. And that was literally true for the other 8 handcart companies. They were moving at a very rapid speed with lots of strength and energy, even when they arrived into the Salt Lake Valley. Now, speaking of these saints over in England, they had been saving for years, some of them 5 years, 10 years, even 15 years, with the hopes of one day making it to Zion. And now, with the handcart system, it was possible. It's recorded here by a man by the name of Millen Atwood, who would become one of the sub-captains of the Willie Handcart Company. He was serving at this time in England as a missionary, and he, along with all the other missionaries who were going back to Utah at that time, their last missionary assignment would be to escort or to captain these immigrating saints that would become known as the Willie Handcart Company. And he says this, speaking of these saints after receiving word from Salt Lake that an opportunity has been made, if they were just willing to walk and pull a handcart. He says, they have prayed and fasted day after day and night after night that they might have the privilege of uniting with their brethren and sisters in these mountains. When Brigham Young offered his property so liberally, which he did, he sold a lot of property to help fund the immigration fund and to help these saints make their dreams a reality. When Brigham Young offered his property so liberally, and the word came that they should gather from England, it ran like fire in dry stubble, and the hearts of the poor saints leaped with joy and gladness. They could hardly contain themselves. On May 4th, 1856, 764 saints from England boarded a ship by the name of Thornton. And on that ship, they would take 6 grueling weeks to cross the Atlantic Ocean, becoming very seasick along the way. A man by the name of Franklin D. Richards, whose name we need to remember throughout this story. He was currently, at this time of the story, in England. He was an immigration officer. He was also the mission president and an apostle. He had a lot of things going on. But it would be his opportunity and really responsibility to get the saints started on this journey. He would be the first immigration agent that these saints would encounter. He would get them on the ship and off their way from England. To receive them in New York City when they arrived on June 14th, 1856, would be an apostle, John Taylor. He would then gather the group, organize them, and hand them train tickets. The train would take them 1,200 miles to Iowa City. That was the end of the train line. It was from that point that they'd be given a handcart and walk the rest of the way to the Salt Lake Valley. But at Iowa City, there was more immigration agents, and then a couple of posts along the way to help guide and reassure these, resupply these immigrating saints. The immigration system was incredible. It was miraculous that it could work so well despite the lack of communication. It was an ingenious system that helped thousands, even tens of thousands of saints successfully make it to the Salt Lake Valley. But back to New York City, where these good saints are now gathered with John Taylor. They were given train tickets. They were put on a train and sent to Iowa City. It would take 8 days on that train. These saints, they didn't have any money, and so they purchased the least expensive train ticket, which gave them a seat on the floor of a train car designed for cattle. 764 of them still en route. The majority of them were women and children under the age of 18. 100 of these immigrating saints were under the age of 6. These statistics are significant as the story continues to unfold. They would take 6 weeks on the boat. They would take 8 weeks on the train, finally arriving in Iowa City. A historian by the name of Wallace Stegner, he said of these saints, most of them, until they were herded from their crowded immigrant ship and dumped here on the brink of the West, had never pitched a tent, slept on the ground, cooked outdoors, or built a campfire. They had not even the rudimentary skills that make frontiersmen. But, as it turned out, they had some of the stuff that makes heroes. So why were they willing to sacrifice so much? Everything that they had in England, businesses, homes, farms, security, peace, some of them prosperity, and family and friends that they left behind. Why would they give up so much, sacrifice it all, to come to Zion? And to do it in a way where this historian points out, this was going to be a nearly impossible task. They've never pitched a tent or cooked over a campfire, and now they'd be expected to do so for over 1,300 miles of walking. So the question that perhaps will always go unanswered is, why did they do it? We can speculate as to why they would do it and give really great and probably accurate answers. But the why they would do it is probably a very individual response. The individual being those that were actually there. But some of the reasons that they may have justified in coming and making such a sacrifice is not only did they want to be in Zion and be part of it, but so many of them recorded that they wanted to help build Zion. They wanted their posterity to mingle with the saints, to be where they could hear the word of the Lord through his prophet. They wanted to be where they could anticipate temple blessings. Now, Wallace Stegner, this historian that I quoted, he concluded after saying listing all the things that were against these saints. He says, but as it turned out, they had some of the stuff that makes heroes. And what was that stuff? Faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. And it was that faith that would compel them towards Zion. So they've made it across the boat, the ocean on a boat. They've made it 8 days in a cattle car on a train, and now they're in Iowa City. They would take that faith, that stuff. They would take that faith and a handcart and they would now start walking to Zion.
In Iowa stands this visitor center owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in front of the visitor center stands this statue representing a family pulling a handcart to Zion. When these good saints arrived in Iowa City, the handcarts weren't ready. The immigration agents had become so overwhelmed with the number of immigrants that season that they were really behind schedule. So they were given either a handcart or, in most cases, given supplies to build their own handcart. Either way, these families, and in many cases individuals, would end up with a handcart that in dimensions were about 3 feet wide and 5 feet long, not very deep in order to hold very much belongings. Typically, about 5 people were assigned to each handcart. Each person was permitted 17 pounds of luggage. And you think about that, 17 pounds is not very much. A gallon of milk weighs about 8.5 pounds. So everyone was permitted to bring the equivalent of 2 gallons of milk. That's it. In addition to their personal belongings being pulled in the handcart, each handcart was assigned 100 pounds of flour. There would be one wagon pulled by oxen per 100 people, and those wagons were designed to carry more flour and the tents. The late departure from England and now the delay in Iowa City because the handcarts weren't ready, this would prove deadly, both of those delays. They were in Iowa City for 3 weeks making their preparations when they were finally able to go and start their journey on July 15th, 1856. This handcart company would be comprised of about 500 people, making up 120 handcarts. They would begin from here their 1,300-mile walk to the Salt Lake Valley. And James Willie, at this point, would be appointed as their leader. So now they were known as the Willie Handcart Company. I think it would be best to take a moment and pause our story and introduce you to James Willie. James was born in England. At age 21, he moved to America. 6 years after that, in 1842, he joined the church and was immediately called to serve as a missionary in the eastern states. In 1846, he met Elizabeth Pettit, and they decided to be married. So they traveled to Nauvoo, where they could be married in the temple. But when they arrived in Nauvoo, they found that Nauvoo was nearly abandoned. Most of the saints had already left for the Salt Lake Valley. They too left Nauvoo and headed towards Salt Lake, arriving there in 1847. Not long after arriving in Utah, he was called to serve back in his native land of England as a missionary. He left Elizabeth and 3 young children at home. At the end of his missionary service in England, he was released from that mission, but he was asked to carry out one final assignment. On his way back to the Salt Lake Valley, he was asked to escort a group of immigrants. This group of immigrants would fall underneath his leadership, and they would all become known as the Willie Handcart Company. Working as sub-captains with Captain Willie was Millen Atwood, Levi Savage, William Woodward, John Chislett, and Johann Amundsen. Under the direction of these leaders, the pioneers would start walking from Iowa. Their next point that they would look forward to would be Florence, Nebraska, 270 miles away. Soon after they started pulling their handcarts out of Iowa City, they were met with thunderstorms, and a lot of them. These were big storms, a lot of wind and a lot of water. It would make the trails super muddy and difficult to pull their handcarts through. At nighttime, the wind was blowing so hard that they couldn't put up their tents. And so the only shelter they had was to sleep underneath their handcarts as the rain and the lightning and the wind danced all around them. The company journal records this, though. Despite the thunderstorms, the saints were all cheerful and doing the best they can. When the rain finally stopped, the temperature rose to 110 degrees. It wasn't only 110 degrees, but because of those thunderstorms, it was incredibly humid. It was muggy. And now it was the temperature and the humidity that made it difficult in moving forward. I want to repeat a quote from a historian, which I already gave at the beginning of this video, but it's well worth repeating at this point in the story as to what we've already experienced and what is to come. Wallace Stegner says, most of them, until they were herded from their crowded immigrant ship and dumped here on the brink of the West, had never pitched a tent, slept on the ground, cooked outdoors, or built a campfire. They had not even the rudimentary skills that make frontiersmen. But, as it turned out, they had some of the stuff that makes heroes. And again, what was some of this stuff? Faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. As these thunderstorms rained down upon the saints, they kept their focus on the Lord Jesus Christ and their reason, the purpose for their journey in making the trek to the valley. As they passed through the towns and the little cities, people would come out to look, and they were curious. They wanted to see what so many hundreds of people pulling hand carts were doing out there in the middle of nowhere. George Cunningham was a member of the Willie Handcart Company when he was just 15 years old. He recorded later in life, people would mock, sneer, and deride us on every occasion for being such fools, as they termed us, and would often throw out inducements to get us to stop. We told them that we were going to Zion, and we would not stop on any account. This did not discourage us in the least, for we knew that we were on the right track. And Millen Atwood, one of the sub-captains, he said, for all their scorn, though, they marveled to see the saints travel on so cheerfully. He described them as they were astonished, and they wanted to know what kind of a doctrine we preached to them to make them willing to undertake such a task. Remember, Millen Atwood, he was one of the sub-captains. So when the people would come out, they would talk to him. And so this is what he meant in his quote. They, meaning the people who weren't in the company, they were astonished and wanted to know what kind of doctrine we as leaders were preaching to these folks that made them so willing to undertake the task. They ate flour. They'd mix it with a little bit of water to make a paste, and that's what they had to eat. They were given 1 pound of flour per person per day. There's only 1,600 calories in a pound of flour. Yet to pull a handcart, particularly on muddy roads, not even with snow yet, but just to pull a handcart on a muddy road, would take 4,000 calories. Now, the 4,000 calories needed, only 1,600 was coming from flour. The rest was being supplemented by beef rations. But because of the thunderstorms, they were afraid that they weren't going to get to where they needed to get to fast enough. They started to get a little concerned about the resupply stations that had been set up for previous handcart companies to be ill supplied, like they were in Iowa City, or maybe not supplied at all. So Captain Willie, along with his sub-captains, decided to cut rations across Iowa and into Nebraska. They reduced that 1 pound of flour down to just 10 ounces of flour. So again, a decrease in a calorie intake, but now an increase of physical exertion because of the muddy roads. There wasn't enough food, and they had constant breakdowns. These handcarts, the handcart system was still trying to be figured out. None of the handcarts had been tried out or experimented with. And so there was constant breakdowns of the handcarts. So without enough food to support the physical toll on their bodies, and with the constant breakdowns, their path or the speed at which they were moving was greatly reduced. These variables, along with others that are yet to come, would lead to tragedy. It would lead to getting caught in the early winter storms when they eventually get to Wyoming. Our historian here, again, Wallace Stegner, he said of this point in their journey, they marked their way with wooden headboards. And on morning, when one of those graves must be left behind, so that they marked their way. He's referring to those who were buried along the way, and all that was given to them as a headstone was just a little headboard or a piece of wood to mark where they were. So they marked their way with wooden headboards, and on morning, when one of those graves must be left behind, there were men and women who went head down, pushing like sleepwalkers at the crossbars of the handcart, and feeling the heaviness of the cart drag like the total weight of what they there gave up. So this historian reminds us that it wasn't just a physical undertaking, but it was now becoming a very emotional undertaking. At this point in the journey, 2 people had passed away across Iowa, but many, many more would be left on the side of the road, even without a headboard marking their way. Eventually, they would arrive in Florence, Nebraska on August 11, 1856. Now that the Saints have made that difficult journey across Iowa and are now in Florence, Nebraska, it's worth taking note of how much time the Willie Handcart Company spent crossing Iowa to get to Florence. They were the 4th handcart company of that year, 1856. The previous 3 handcart companies had left much earlier in the season, and they had taken from Iowa City to Florence, Nebraska, 69 days, 73 days, and 60 days, respectively, to make that journey. Willie made that same journey in just 52 days. They were moving at an incredibly fast rate, despite all those thunderstorms. They were moving so fast because they knew it was late in the year. And if they didn't keep that fast pace up, they are likely to be caught in a winter storm before arriving in the Salt Lake Valley. Now in Florence, Nebraska, and the reality of the lateness of the season setting in, the company had a decision to make. Should we stay here for the winter, or should we press forward to the Salt Lake Valley? James Willie encouraged the company to keep moving forward to the Salt Lake Valley. Now, Florence, Nebraska is the same location as winter quarters. When the Saints left Nauvoo and made their journey towards the Salt Lake Valley, many of them stayed at winter quarters, where they would hunker down for the winter, wait for the spring to conclude their journey to the Salt Lake Valley. Winter quarters, as it was set up for those early immigrating Saints from Nauvoo, no longer existed. It wasn't there for very long, and now 10 years later, winter quarters was long gone. And so the Saints, the Willie Handcart Company, they're in the same geographic location. They didn't have any claim to land, homes, supplies, farms, opportunities for employment. None of it was there like it had been for the earlier Saints. And so James Willie says we have to move on, or we might perish here waiting for spring. Levi Savage gave a differing opinion. From his journal, he records this: August 13, 1856, Wednesday, Florence, Nebraska Territory. Today we continued preparations for starting. Evening, we held a meeting in camp. Brother Willie exhorted the Saints to go forward, regardless of suffering, even to death. After he had spoken, he gave me the opportunity of speaking. I said to him that if I spoke, I must speak my mind. Let it cut where it would. He said certainly to do so. I then related to the Saints the hardships that we should have to endure. I said that we were liable to have to wade in snow up to our knees and shovel at night, lay ourselves in a thin blanket and lie on the frozen ground without a bed. I said it was not like having a wagon that we could go into and wrap ourselves in as much as we liked and lie down. No, said I, we are without wagons, destitute of clothing, and could not carry it if we had it. We must go as we are. The handcart system I do not condemn. I think it preferable to unbroken oxen and inexperienced teamsters. The lateness of the season was my only objection to leaving this point for the mountains at this time. I spoke warmly upon the subject, but spoke truth. John Chislett, he records, that in speaking these words, quote, Levi Savage used his common sense and his knowledge of the country. He declared positively that to his certain knowledge, we would not cross the mountains with a mixed company of aged people, women, and little children so late in the season without much suffering, sickness, and death. He therefore advised going into winter quarters without delay. George Cunningham, recalling this experience, Levi Savage's testimony, said, He counseled the old, weak, and sickly to stop until another spring. The tears commenced to flow down his cheeks, and he prophesied that if such undertook the journey at that late season of year, their bodies would strewn the way. After Levi Savage spoke, Captain Willie stood and spoke. And Levi Savage recorded in his journal, Elder Willie then spoke again in reply to what I had said, evidently dissatisfied, and said that the God he served was a God that was able to save to the uttermost. The immigrants then took a vote, and they voted to move forward. It's difficult to understand the saints. It must have been very difficult for them to understand the testimony of Levi Savage. Levi had crossed the plains before. He understood the difficulty and the severity of a potential winter storm. But as they sat there in Florence, it was over 100 degrees. And the thought that it would change so dramatically was perhaps unfathomable to people so unfamiliar with the territory. Emma James recorded that her mother, in response to Levi Savage's testimony, she says, We really don't have much choice. We must put our trust in God as we have always done. During this same time, or this same meeting, Levi Savage was again invited to stand and speak after Captain Willie had made the plea with the saints to continue moving forward, and the saints had voted to move forward. He then stood and said, Brothers and sisters, what I have said I know to be true. But seeing you are to go forward, I will go with you, will help you all I can, will work with you, will rest with you, will suffer with you, and if necessary, I will die with you. May God in his mercy bless and preserve us. With nothing but faith, these good saints would carry on. The members of the Willie Handcart Company would spend 5 days in Florence, Nebraska before getting back out on the trail. Those 5 days were busy. It not only gave them an opportunity to rest and relax, but they were also busy having these conversations of are we to continue or not. But they also needed to spend that time repairing their handcarts and resupplying some of their provisions the best that they could. They would also need that time to mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually prepare themselves for the next leg of this difficult journey. That next leg would take them to Fort Laramie. That was their next destination, Fort Laramie, Wyoming, which was 522 miles in the distance. So after 5 days in Florence, they left on August 16th, 1856. They left Florence optimistic, full of hope. They had 5 days to relax a little bit. They got resupplied. They felt good. They felt energized, and they were ready for the next portion of their journey. Now, the next portion of the journey, it was easy to follow along the trail. It was simply get on the north bank of the Platte River and just keep walking. So they followed that river 522 miles. It would take them 51 days to make the journey from Florence to Fort Laramie. That's an average of about 12 miles per day. They're just a few days into that journey, however, these windstorms came and caused a lot of trouble for the saints. The windstorms were fierce, they were powerful, and they were long-lasting. Now, out there on the plains of Nebraska, it stirred up whatever was on the ground, which was really nothing but dirt and sand. And so as this dirt and sand would be flown into the air and pelted against the saints with nowhere to find shelter from these storms, they simply had to endure the high winds and the dust and the dirt and the sand that came with it. That sand made the roads difficult to walk through and pull handcarts through. It also put a lot of dust, dirt, and sand in their eyes and in every portion of their clothing, their provisions, and anything else that they had in their handcarts. So it was a dirty mess as well as a physical trying moment as well. One day, one of these storms got really out of control. It was a big storm, and it was so big that it startled a herd of buffalo. And so these buffalo started to stampede, and they started to stampede right towards the Willie Handcart Company. Fortunately, the people weren't injured, but it did startle all their cattle, and their cattle scattered. The cattle ran in every direction to try to save themselves from this stampeding herd of buffalo. After the buffalo were gone and the wind started to die down, it was then the responsibility of the handcart saints to go and find these lost cattle. 30 of them had wandered off and they were nowhere to be found. It took them several days to find some of the cattle. In fact, they were only able to find 12 of them, and the remaining cattle were never found. Now, there's a few problems with this. Not only was there an unexpected job that people had to go out in search of this cattle, but losing so many cattle was a big deal because the cattle were used to pull the supply wagons. The supply wagons which held all the excess flour and the tents. With only finding 12 of the cattle, each of those cattle were now burdened in pulling the wagons with less cattle. Each wagon was pulled by 6 cattle. But then when this storm and the buffalo came and we lost so many cattle, instead of having 6 to pull each wagon, we now had 2. So we have 2 cattle doing the work of 6. Now, how does this impact the saints? First, they lost time in looking for the cattle, time that they didn't have. Secondly, with only 2 cattle pulling each wagon instead of 6, those wagons are going to move slower, increasing the danger of getting caught in a winter storm. Now, it is mid-August, but they are panicking because they know that soon, October, November, it's going to get very cold, and perhaps these deadly storms will come. And they were right. They would be coming. Also, with the loss of cattle, they lost their food supply. They were using their flour in conjunction with beef to make up their daily meals. And with the loss of beef, their bodies are now reliant only on flour, which they don't have enough of, because the idea was to have enough flour to go with the beef to satisfy the hunger, provide the energy and strength to move forward. Now we don't have the beef. Do we not have enough food, or do we start using more food than we can? The hope was that they would be able to resupply in Fort Laramie, but they weren't very optimistic about that resupply location or having much supply there, if there was any at all. So they're down to a lot of serious problems here. George Cunningham, who was a member of the Willie Handcart Company, said of this time, "It was evident to all that our provisions were getting very short. We had between 600 and 700 miles to travel to accomplish our journey, which we would be compelled to do or perish in the mountain snows." It wasn't a secret. We've got to get there, and we've got to get there quickly. We've now lost time looking for this cattle. We now have to go slower because we don't have enough cattle. And now we don't have enough food. But we still have to go further, faster. Anne Rowley, she said, "This was the beginning of our great hardships, and probably was the cause of most of them." And her quote goes on, but let's recap here. She recognized this storm in Nebraska and the buffalo and the scattering of the cattle and the loss of so much help in pulling the wagons and food supplies. She says she was recollecting this later in her life, and she says that was the turning point. That's where everything started to go downhill. So she says, this was the beginning of our great hardships and probably was the cause of most of them. For we had spent valuable time looking for the oxen. This loss in turn reduced our meat supply. And because there weren't enough cattle to pull the supply wagons, 100 pounds of flour was placed in each handcart. Our handcarts were not designed for such heavy loads and were constantly breaking down. Now, one thing that I didn't mention that Anne Rowley did is, yes, their food supply is dwindling, but they must increase their pace and work harder and carry an extra 100 pounds of flour in doing so. And because of the fast pace and the heavy loads, we're now going to have to spend more time fixing our hand carts. But through it all, they still saw the grace of God. They still saw the blessings. Those tender mercies were still evident to the members of the handcart company. When Levi Savage wrote in his journal of all of these circumstances, as I and Anne Rowley and George Cunningham have summarized, he said this: surely the hand of the Lord is with us yet. Because they did somehow muster up the strength to carry on each day. They did somehow, in some miraculous way, continue to keep their focus locked on the purpose of the journey. And the purpose of their journey gave them the strength to continue to move forward with faith in the Lord. Levi Savage made that comment, particularly when he noted in his journal that 2 oxen, miraculously at this point, seemed to be able to do the work of what previously 6 oxen were able to do. John Chislett, he recalled of this moment as well. It was hard, really hard, for the folks to lose the use of their cattle, have beef rations stopped, and haul an extra 100 pounds or more in their carts. Every man and woman, however, worked to their utmost to put forward toward the goal of their hopes. With these conditions, they continued moving forward. On September 12th, Franklin D. Richards happens to come into camp. Franklin D. Richards, you'll remember, set these good saints on the ship back in Liverpool. It was time for him to return home back to Salt Lake City after his mission in Europe, and he was making his way to Salt Lake. He wasn't pulling a handcart. He had the luxury of going by steamship and then to have a horse-drawn wagon or carriage to take him to Salt Lake. He was able to move much, much faster than the handcart companies, of course. And this was a miraculous meeting because on September 12th, Franklin D. Richards was able to come into camp, assess the situation, know exactly where they were on the trail and how fast they were moving and how fast they were expected to be moving. And with all of this information, he was able to speed ahead to Salt Lake City and report to Brigham Young. Brigham Young didn't know there were still saints out on the plains. Not only the Willie Handcart Company, but way behind them was even the Martin Handcart Company. This would spark the beginning of the rescue that is needed and necessary and will be coming later. Brigham Young didn't know of this situation until Franklin D. Richards reported to him in Salt Lake. It was at that point that Brigham Young immediately put the rescue effort into motion. Had Franklin D. Richards been delayed or stayed back in Europe another week or 2 or 3 weeks, all of the saints would have perished, as you'll see later in the story. Had he been early and arrived and met the saints maybe in Iowa City or even in Florence, he would have seen the good conditions that they were in, the good pace that they were making, and he may not have reported at all to Brigham Young, or at least his report wouldn't have been such a dire report. Arriving on September 12th, after the storms, after the buffalo, when meat rations were done with, he saw exactly the doom that was impending and was able to report accurately to Brigham Young. It was a miracle that Franklin D. Richards arrived at the moment that he did. to see the conditions that these saints were in at that particular time. However, Franklin D. Richards, he's spending his time in camp. He learned from Captain Willie about the meeting in Florence, about how they had to decide to move forward, and obviously they concluded to move forward. But Franklin D. Richards was also told, and maybe not by Captain Willie, but by somebody, about Levi Savage and his warnings and his pleading that they don't move forward. Franklin D. Richards gathered the Willie Handcart Company together, and perhaps in a way to encourage the Handcart members or to boost morale, he spoke about how the saints were going to be just fine. He said, keep moving forward, everything's going to work out, and don't listen to those who think otherwise. He then publicly chastised Levi Savage and for the things that he had said back in Florence. Now, I give Franklin D. Richards credit in that it was too late. They had to keep moving forward at this point. And so perhaps Elder Richards was thinking, I've got to boost the morale and get the energy and the spirits of the saints up so that they have the best chance possible to make the rest of the journey. I think maybe that was his purpose, and he wasn't just a bad guy wanting to be mean to Levi Savage. But publicly ridiculing him was a byproduct of the overall purpose that perhaps Elder Richards intended. Nevertheless, the public reprimand took place. And Levi Savage certainly would have been embarrassed. Inside, maybe he was angry or felt like he needed to defend himself or have his own say. Yet he didn't. He stayed quiet. In fact, he stayed silent and didn't say anything to these public reprimandings. That was a miracle in and of itself. Those words could have been divisive. It could have split the company. It could have demoralized them perhaps. But Levi Savage took the high road, took the public reprimand without giving any defense to himself, and continued to move on. It shows the character of Levi: humble, obedient, willing to follow the counsel of those that presided over him, even if he disagreed with it. He continued to work as sub-captain and to work very tirelessly. And as we will see, he will be one of the heroes that helped save so many lives later in our story. Now, despite the difficulties that they had already faced, Elder Richards recorded in his journal, "Never was there a more soul-stirring sight than the happy passage of this company. Several of the carts were driven entirely by women, and every heart was glad and full of hope." He would leave, Elder Richards would leave the Willie Handcart Company and speed towards Salt Lake to give the report to Brigham Young that the saints were coming. Finally, the saints arrived at Fort Laramie in Wyoming. They had gone 522 miles from Florence, Nebraska. Fort Laramie was like Florence, Nebraska, a resupply stop. They would resupply in Florence to make that 522-mile journey with the idea that just as their food was running out, they would be resupplied with food at Fort Laramie, and enough food would be given that they could make it from there into the Salt Lake Valley. However, when the saints arrived in Fort Laramie, they found that there was nothing available for them. Fort Laramie had been closed for the winter. Everybody had gone home and taken the supplies with them. They didn't realize that the Willie Handcart Company and the Martin Handcart Companies were still out on the plains in desperate need of provisions. When they left Florence, Nebraska, they had taken with them a 60-day supply of food. That equates to 1 pound of flour per person per day. Now, it is possible to get from Florence to the Salt Lake Valley on 60 days worth of food, but they would have had to travel at 17 miles per day, every day, including Sunday. 1 pound of flour was only 1,600 calories. They were exerting about 4,000 calories. And with that deficiency not being made up by beef because all the cattle were gone, they were in a real physical dire situation. And not only were they in a dire physical situation, but they now needed to go faster in order to make it to the Salt Lake Valley before running out of food. It would be necessary to go 17 miles a day, but they had only been traveling at 12 miles a day per average. If they continued at just 12 miles a day, now not having any resupplies at Fort Laramie, they would be out of flour in 18 days or 300 miles from the Salt Lake Valley. To make things even worse, the people in Salt Lake didn't even know that the Handcart Company was out there. The day they arrived in Fort Laramie and found that they're not going to make it, Elder Richards was still 3 days away from Salt Lake to let Brigham Young know that the Saints were still out on the plains. It would take him 3 days to get there. It would then take 7 days to make the announcement, get the goods, and get the rescuers out on the plains. It's a total of 10 days, which leaves the Saints with only 8 days worth of flour, and it would take more than 8 days for the rescuers to get to the Handcart Company. Captain Willie's hope, his only hope, was that he could meet the rescuers, if they were coming, at South Pass. To get to South Pass, they would need to cut rations and move faster. It would be necessary to cut rations from a pound of flour per day per person to 3/4 of a pound per person per day, and move faster, and now work harder as well, as they're approaching the most difficult portion of the entire trail. They have no food, they've lost hope, and now there's more work to be done. The son of David Reeder recorded this: "My father, David Reeder, would start out in the morning and pull his cart until he had dropped on the road. He did this day after day until he did not arise early on October 1st, that same day they arrived at Fort Laramie. He was found dead in his bed. Sister Eliza wrapped a cherished sheet around him, and we placed him in a shallow grave, hoping that the wolves would not disturb him. We must go on our way in a silent mourning and in a weakened condition." Pictured here next to me is a landmark, nicknamed Independence Rock. It's in Wyoming. This landmark is one that all the pioneers would look for with anticipation, knowing that, hey, when we get to Independence Rock, we're only about 350 miles from the Salt Lake Valley. It was nicknamed Independence Rock because you really needed to be there by Independence Day in order to make it to the Salt Lake Valley before the winter storms came. The Willie Handcart Company would arrive here at Independence Rock on October 14th. Here, they had just 5 days worth of food and 350 miles to go. Captain Willie only had one choice: cut rations again. This time all the way down to just half a pound of flour per person per day. That would equate to about 800 calories, or maybe 2 slices of bread, while still pulling the hand carts. They had hope of making it to South Pass, where they hoped that rescuers would be there to help them. But in order to get to South Pass from Independence Rock, they would have to wade through and cross the Sweetwater River 8 times in their weakened condition, and they would have to now go from 12 miles a day to 20 miles a day. And if they were able to do that, they could make the South Pass just as the last flour was running out. They would hope that help would be there. Levi Savage writes of this moment of their trek: "The people are getting weak and failing very fast. A great many sick. Our teams are also failing fast, and it requires great exertion to make any progress." With all these variables against them that I've so far explained, now, just as they pass Independence Rock, winter would come. And winter would come strong, hard, and heavy, and it would come fast. These next few pictures are of the Pioneer Trail. It's the actual pioneer trail where these saints walked. And it's at the actual precise location where the following events took place, as recorded in journal entries that I'm now going to read to you. The first being from John Chislett. While here in this area, he wrote, "We had not traveled far up the Sweetwater before the nights, which had gradually become colder since we left Laramie, became very severe. The mountains before us, as we approached nearer to them, revealed themselves to view mantled nearly to the base in snow, and tokens of a coming storm were discernible in the clouds, which each day seemed to lower around us. Our 17 pounds of clothing and bedding was now altogether insufficient for our comfort. Nearly all suffered more or less at night from cold. Instead of getting up in the morning strong, refreshed, vigorous, and prepared for the hardships of another day of toil, these poor saints were to be seen crawling from their tents, looking haggard, benumbed, and showing an utter lack of the vitality so necessary to our success. It was surprising to an unmarried man as I to witness the devotion of men to their families and to their faith. Under these trying circumstances, many a father would pull his cart with his little children on it until the day preceding his death. I have seen some pull their carts in the morning, give out during the day, and die before next morning. These people died with the calm faith and fortitude of martyrs. Their greatest regret seemed to be leaving their families behind them and their bodies on the plains or mountains instead of being laid in the consecrated ground of Zion. The sorrow and mourning of the bereaved, as they saw their husbands and fathers rudely interned, were affecting in the extreme, and none but a heart of stone could repress a tear of sympathy at the sad spectacle." At this point, that's the end of the quote. At this point, one might think that these so many saints may have turned to selfishness and greed. So little food and so little provisions, perhaps there was contention, but there wasn't. George Cunningham, who was there, he recorded some would sacrifice themselves by giving their food, or perhaps some old blanket that covered them. In common cares, we cannot tell what our friends and neighbors are, but there are circumstances which undoubtedly proved them. End of quote. This was one of those moments where these saints proved through their kindness and generosity to those around them of just how Christ-like they were. They were willing to be more like Christ than they were to maintain their own health and life. John Chislett in his journal continues as they continued down this very trail. "Cold weather, scarcity of food, and fatigue from overexertion soon produced their effects. Our old and infirm people began to droop, and they no sooner lost spirit and courage than death's stamp could be traced upon their features. Life went out as smoothly as a lamp ceases to burn when the oil is gone. At first the deaths occurred slowly and irregularly, but in a few days at more frequent intervals, until soon we thought it unusual to leave a campground without burying one or two persons. Death was not long confined in its ravages to the old and infirm, but the young and naturally strong were among its victims. Men who were, so to speak, as strong as lions when they started on their journey, and who had been our best supporters, were compelled to succumb to the grim monster. These men were worn down by hunger, scarcity of clothing and bedding, and too much labor in helping their families. Weakness and debility were accompanied by dysentery. This we could not stop or even alleviate, no proper medicines being in the camp, and in almost every instance it carried off the parties attacked." A man by the name of William James recorded at this point in the journey, many were weakening from the lack of nourishing food. The young and the old and the weak began to die quietly. Even the strong men, who were secretly giving their portion to their families, pulled their carts until they died. Soon rations were cut again. clothing in rags, especially shoes. Any piece of rag, burlap, or canvas was tied around the feet. All too soon, this was chewed through by the tortuous terrain. It was not uncommon to take clothing from the dead to cover the living, and many lives were saved this way. On October 18th, the Handcart Company reached the fifth crossing of the Sweetwater River. They had to wade through that river that was now freezing cold. And yet, South Pass, the location where they hoped to have rescuers meet them there, was still 56 miles away. And now they are down to 1 day supply of food. It's recorded that when they pulled into camp that night on October 18th, there was not enough men in the company to pitch a single tent. When the saints awoke on the morning of October 19th, they knew that that day would be a very difficult one. They had eaten the last of their flour the night before, and today it was necessary to travel 16 miles to the bank of the Sweetwater River. They had to go that far because between themselves and the river, there was no wood to burn and no fresh water to drink. And making that 16-mile journey through the snow and the wind was nearly impossible. Along this trail, as they were making that 16-mile journey, John Chislett recorded, "As we were resting for a short time, a light wagon was driven into our camp from the west. Its occupants were Joseph A. Young and Stephen Taylor. They informed us that a train of supplies was on the way, and we might expect to meet it in a day or two. More welcome messengers never came from the courts of glory than these two young men were to us." End of quote. Joseph A. Young and Stephen Taylor, in their little wagon, had enough food to distribute to the saints that would last them for a day or two. John Chislett continues, "After this mini rescue, we pursued our journey with renewed hope, and after untold toil and fatigue, doubling teams frequently, going back to fetch up the struggling carts, and encouraging those who had dropped by the way to a little more exertion in view of our soon-to-be improved condition, we finally, late at night, got all to camp, the wind howling frightfully, and the snow eddying around us in fitful gusts. But we had found a good camp among the willows, and after warming and partially drying ourselves before good fires, we ate our scanty fare, paid our usual devotions to deity, and retired to rest with hopes of coming aid." After meeting these initial two rescuers, the saints were given a small supply of food. With that food, and now with renewed hope and encouragement of making it, they did. They made it here to the bank of the Sweetwater River on October 19th. Next to the bank of the river is this beautiful meadow. It was here that the Willie Handcart Company would camp and await the further rescuers to arrive. On the day that I was here in this meadow, the temperature was well below zero and the wind was bone-piercing. I want to play you a video that gives you an idea of what it was like when the Willie Handcart Company was here. The only thing missing was the foot of snow that dropped on them overnight. In regards to their first night here in this meadow, William Woodward would record, "A snow fell on us that night, about a foot deep. It was a sorry sight. Over 400 people with handcarts, short of bedding, and to sleep on the cold ground. One thought is enough for a lifetime." And John Chislett would record, "Our cattle strayed widely during the storm, and some of them died. But what was worse to us than all this was the fact that 5 persons lay in the cold embrace of death. The pitiless storm and the extra march of the previous day had been too much for their wasted energies, and they had passed through the dark valley to the bright world beyond. We buried these 5 people in one grave, wrapped only in the clothing and bedding in which they died. We had no materials with which to make coffins, and even if we had, we could not have spared time to make them, for it required all the efforts of the healthy few who remained to perform the ordinary camp duties and to look after the sick, the number of whom were increasing daily on our hands, notwithstanding so many dying. Because the company's last ration of flour had been issued the previous morning, all they had left in the commissary were a few pounds of sugar and dried apples, a particle sack of rice, and the hard bread that Captain Willie had obtained at Fort Laramie. This was hardly enough for a one-day supply, but it was distributed as far as it would go. In addition to the last food, 2 of the skin and bone cattle were killed and issued for beef. With this, we were informed that we would have to subsist until the coming supplies reached us. So they decided to wait here in this meadow for the promised supply wagons to reach them. John Chislett continues, "The scanty allowance of hard bread and poor beef was mostly consumed the first day by the hungry, ravenous, famished souls. We killed more cattle and issued the meat, but eating it without any bread did not satisfy hunger, and to those who were suffering from dysentery, it did more harm than good. This terrible disease increased rapidly among us, and several died from it. Before we renewed our journey, the camp became so offensive and filthy that words would fail to describe its condition, and even common decency forbids the attempt. Suffice it to say that all the disgusting scenes which the reader might imagine would certainly not equal the terrible reality. It was enough to make the heavens weep. The recollection of it remains in me now. During the time I visited the sick, the widows whose husbands died in serving them, and the aged who could not help themselves, to know for myself where to dispense the few articles that had been placed in my charge for distribution. Such craving hunger I never saw before, and may God, in His mercy, spare me the sight again. As I was seen giving these things to the most needy, crowds of famished men and women surrounded me and begged for bread. Men whom I had known all the way from Liverpool, who had been true as steel in every stage of our journey, who in their homes in England and Scotland had never known want, men who by honest labor had sustained themselves and their families, and saved enough to cross the Atlantic and traverse the United States, whose hearts were cast in too great a mold to descend to a mean act or broke dishonor. Such men as these came to me and begged bread." John Linford is one of the individuals who died in this meadow. This little memorial marker is dedicated to him. It was placed here by his descendants. John and his wife Maria lived in England, where they heard about the gospel, they accepted it, and were baptized. At the time, John was a shoemaker, and he had a good, profitable business, until he joined the church. At that time, his extended family, his friends, neighbors, other associates, they stopped buying shoes from John as a way of protesting him and Maria joining the church. They didn't have much money. Despite them not having much money, they continued to pay their tithing, and they even donated to the building of the Nauvoo Temple. One of their children recalls during of this time of their family's life, "My noble mother stood by my father without a murmur in this hour of trial. It was a dark outlook for a husband and a father as financial ruin and starvation stared him in the face." Here in this valley, just before he passed away, Maria, his wife, asked him if he regretted coming on the journey in an attempt to make it to Zion. He replied as some of his last dying words, "No, Maria, I'm glad we came. I shall not live to reach Salt Lake, but you and the boys will. And I do not regret all we have gone through if our boys can grow up and raise their families in Zion." John would pass away here in the meadow the very day that the rescuers would arrive. Maria and their 3 children would make it safely the rest of the way into the Salt Lake Valley. A few years later, Maria would be sealed to John in the endowment house by Brigham Young. What's pictured here is what's referred to as the eminence. It's a small elevation in the landscape, a little bit of a hill, but it's not far from the meadow. In fact, the eminence and the meadow are divided by the Sweetwater River, and when standing in one of any of those three geographical locations, you can see the other two landmarks. John Chislett records this: just as the sun was sinking beautifully behind the distant hills, on an eminence immediately west of our camp, several covered wagons, each drawn by 4 horses, were seen coming towards us. The news ran through the camp like wildfire, and all who were able to leave their beds turned out en masse to see them. Shouts of joy rent the air. Strong men wept till tears ran freely down their sunburnt cheeks, and little children partook in the joy, which of some of them hardly understood, and fairly danced around with gladness. Restraint was set aside in the general rejoicing, and as the brethren entered our camp, the sisters fell upon the brethren with kisses. The brethren were so overcome that they could not for some time utter a word, but in choking silence repressed all demonstration of those emotions that evidently must master them. Soon, however, feeling was somewhat abated, and such a shaking of hands, such words of welcome, and such invocation of God's blessing have ever seldom been witnessed. That evening, for the first time in quite a period, the songs of Zion were to be heard in the camp. The laughter issued from the little knots of people as they chatted around fires. The change seemed almost miraculous. So sudden was it from grave to gay, from sorrow to gladness, from mourning to rejoicing. With the cravings of hunger satisfied and with hearts filled with gratitude to God and our good brethren, we all united in prayer and then retired to rest. A woman by the name of Mary Huron, she also recorded in her journal: Captain Willie went ahead through snow to meet the relief wagons and urged them to hurry as the people were freezing and starving to death. If help had not come when it did, there would have been no one left to tell the tale. As a small girl, I could hear the squeaking of the wagons as they came through the snow before I was able to see them. Tears streamed down the cheeks of men, and the children danced for joy. As soon as the people could control their feelings, they all knelt down in the snow and gave thanks to God for his kindness and goodness unto them. The last supply of food in the camp had been given out 2 days before the relief wagons came. They came just in time to save our lives. When the rescuers found the Willie Handcart Company in that meadow, it was miraculous. The timing of it was miraculous because they got there just in time to save the entire company from starving to death. But it wasn't only the timing that was miraculous, it was also the location. Because when the Willie Handcart Company left that meadow, they would then have to ascend Rocky Ridge. You can see behind me in this picture of Rocky Ridge, the trail, the Pioneer Trail still carved out in the hillside. They would have to go up and over Rocky Ridge, a 700-foot increase in elevation over a course of 2 miles. After ascending and crossing over Rocky Ridge, it was then another 15 miles to their next campground, which would be Rock Creek Hollow. To ascend Rocky Ridge and then to go through those last 15 miles, it would take the company 20 hours to do so. It wasn't only the distance that was difficult, but it was the bitter winter storm that came upon them at the time that they made this portion of the journey. 18 inches of snow covered the trail. A fierce wind was blowing, and temperatures were below 0 degrees. It was nicknamed the Forced March because if you stopped moving, you would die. I'm going to show you video and pictures of Rocky Ridge while I tell you the stories of some of these faithful saints who made the trip up and over. This monument is found at the base of Rocky Ridge. On it is inscribed, The James Willie Handcart Company was rescued on October 21st, 1856, by a rescue party sent by Brigham Young. 21 members of the Willie Company perished in this valley due to a severe winter storm and lack of clothing and food. Captain Willie left in search of the rescuers. When he returned with the wagons, it was recorded cries of joy rent the air. Most of the rescuers and wagons went on to the Martin Handcart Company, which also had become stranded approximately 70 miles east at Martin's Cove. The still weakened Willie Company made its ascent of Rocky Ridge on October 22, 1856. Deep snows, chilling wind, and starvation resulted in a 27-hour journey over 15 miles of the most difficult portion of the trail to Rock Creek Hollow, where an additional 15 pioneers died. This monument is constructed to the memory of those courageous pioneers of the Willie Handcart Company and the brave men who rescued them. Now for a few stories as recorded by those who were actually there. Levi Savage. We buried our dead, got up our teams, and about 9:00 a.m. commenced ascending the rocky ridge. This was a severe day. The wind blew awfully hard and cold. The ascent was some 5 miles long, and some places steep and covered with deep snow. We became weary, sat down to rest, and some became chilled and commenced to freeze. Joseph Elder. That was an awful day. Many can never forget the scenes they witnessed that day. Men, women, and children weakened down by the cold and hunger, weeping, crying, and some even dying by the roadside. It was very late before we all got into camp. Oh, how my heart did quake and shudder at the awful scenes which surrounded me. William James was immigrating with his wife Jane and their young children. His oldest daughter, Sarah, recorded of the events just before they ascended Rocky Ridge. It was a bitter cold morning in October as we broke camp. As usual, there were dead to be buried before we could go on. Father and Reuben, her younger brother, were with the burial detail. Mother, who was helping pull the heaviest cart, had stayed behind until they could finish their sad work. After a short service, we other children ran ahead to catch the rest of the company, and Mother and Reuben started to follow. Father collapsed and fell in the snow. He tried 2 or 3 more times to get up with Mother's help. Then finally, he asked her to go on, and when he felt rested, he would come on later. Mother knew in her heart that he had given out. But perhaps, she said, in a few minutes, with some rest, he could come on. 13-year-old Reuben would stay behind with his father, as Jane would decide to hurry and catch up with the other children who had gone on ahead. But the daughter continues. Mother was placed in an awful position, her husband unable to go farther, and her little children far ahead, hungry and freezing. What could be done? Father said, "Go to the children. We will get in if we can." She found us on the river bank. We were too frightened and tired to cross alone. We had forded this river many times, but it had never seemed so far across. It was about 40 feet, I guess, to the other bank. Mother soon had us on our way. The icy water soon froze to our clothing and to our bodies. Our feet were frozen numb, cold and miserable. We reached the other bank, put on dry clothing, and joined the rest of the company. When we stopped for the night, we made inquiries about Father and Reuben, but nothing had been heard of them. Since there were some who had been a few hours behind us, we felt they would come with the next group. All night we waited for word. Toward morning, some of the captains, who had gone out to gather up the stragglers, came into camp with the dead body of my father and the badly frozen body of my brother Reuben. John Chislett. The day we crossed Rocky Ridge, it was snowing a little, the wind hard from the northwest, and blowing so keenly that it almost pierced us through. We had to wrap ourselves closely in blankets, quilts, or whatever else we could get to keep from freezing. Captain Willie still attended to the details of the company's traveling, and this day he appointed me to bring up the rear. My duty was to stay behind everything and see that nobody was left along the road. I had to bury a man, and as I finished doing so, after the company had started, In about a half hour, I set out on foot along to do my duty as rear guard of the camp. The ascent of the ridge commenced soon after leaving camp, and I had not gone far up it before I overtook a cart that the folks could not pull through the snow, here about knee deep. I helped them along, and we soon overtook another. By all hands getting onto one cart, we could travel. So we moved one of the carts a few rods, and then went back and brought up the other. After moving in this way for a while, we overtook other carts at different points on the hill, until we had 6 carts, not one of which could be moved by the parties owning it. And Rolly. In traveling at night, in the frost of that altitude, my 10-year-old son Thomas's right hand froze while he was pushing on the back of the cart. And when we stopped at night and his hand got warm, it swelled up like a toad. My other son, John, could finally go no farther, and I felt my heart would break as I saw him laying beside the trail, waiting for the sick wagon. By the time he was picked up, his body was frozen in 2 places. That night, 12 people died, and the next morning, 3 people joined them. Jens and Elsie Nielsen were also traveling with the Willie Handcart Company up and over Rocky Ridge. They had along with them their 6-year-old son, Nils, and also a 10-year-old girl by the name of Bodil Mortensen. The Mortensens were too poor to make the journey as a full family, so they sent Bodil ahead with the Nielsens in hopes that the rest of the family would be able to save up enough money and join her in Zion later. While going over Rocky Ridge, Yin's feet became worthless. They were completely frozen and he couldn't walk. Elsie said to him, quote, "Ride. I can't leave you, but I can pull the cart." Jens climbed into the cart and Elsie pulled him up and over the ridge. They survived, but their 6-year-old son did not. He died during the climb and was buried the next day with 12 others in a common grave. Also in that common grave would be Bodil Mortensen. In a general conference talk, President James E. Faust tells her story. When they arrived at camp, she must have been sent out to gather firewood. She was found frozen to death, leaning against the wheel of her handcart, clutching sagebrush. Jens, several years later, looking back on this time, he wrote, "No person can describe it. It cannot be comprehended or understood by any human in this life, but only those who are called to pass through it." Margaret Kirkwood was a widow who was immigrating with her 4 sons, Robert, Thomas, James, and Joseph. Her husband and 2 daughters had died previously, before they had even left England. President James E. Faust told the story of James and Joseph as they crossed Rocky Ridge. President Faust said, "On the trip west, James was accompanied by his widowed mother and 3 brothers, one of whom, Thomas, was 19 and crippled and had to ride in the cart. James, who was just 11, had the primary responsibility on the trek to care for his little 5-year-old brother Joseph, while his mother and oldest brother Robert pulled the cart. As they climbed Rocky Ridge, it was snowing, and there was a bitter cold wind blowing. It took the whole company over 20 hours to travel 15 miles. When little Joseph became too weak and weary to walk, James, the older brother, had no choice but to carry him. Left behind the main group, James and Joseph made their way slowly to camp. When the 2 finally arrived at the fireside, James, having so faithfully carried out his task, collapsed and died from exposure and overexertion. President Faust would also say, "As I walked over Rocky Ridge, I wondered if I have sacrificed enough. In my generation, I have not seen so much sacrifice by so many. I wonder what more I should have done, and should be doing, to further this work." From the top of the ridge, the Saints would follow this trail 15 more miles to Rock Creek Hollow. After crossing Rocky Ridge and making their way down that 15-mile trail, the Saints finally arrived at their next campsite, which is this little valley called Rock Creek Hollow. On October 24th, 1856, John Chislett recorded, "There are so many dead and dying that it was decided to lie by for the day. In the forenoon, I was appointed to go round the camp and collect the dead. I took with me 2 young men to assist me in the sad task, and we collected together, of all ages and both sexes, 13 corpses, all stiffly frozen. We had a large square hole dug in which we buried these 13 people, 3 or 4 abreast and 3 deep. When they did not fit in, we put 1 or 2 crosswise at the head or feet of the others. We covered them with willows, and then with the earth. Had I not myself witnessed it, I could not have believed it. But so it was. 2 others died during the day, and we buried them in one grave, making 15 in all buried on that campground." The 2 grave sites are still visible today. They have since put a wooden fence around each of them to protect and maintain the sacredness of the 2 grave sites, this one being the one that holds 13 of the pioneers, and this grave site being the one that holds 2. Between these 2 graves are interned William James, age 46, Elizabeth Bailey, age 52, James Kirkwood, age 11, Samuel Gadd, age 10, Lars Wenden, age 60, Ann Olson, age 46, Ella Nilsson, age 22, Bodil Mortensen, age 10, Nils Anderson, age 41, Ole Madsen, age 41, James Gibb, age 67, Chesterton Gilman, age 66, Thomas Goldstone, age 62, Williams Groves, age 22, and Jens Nielsen, age 6. The day after the Saints arrived here at Rock Creek Hollow, they were met by Reddick Allred, a rescuer from Salt Lake. He arrived with several wagons of food and supplies. This was another miraculous timing. Had Reddick Allred been delayed even one day, certainly there would have been much more death. They had to press on. They left Rock Creek Hollow, and somehow they just kept moving. Levi Savage said of this, "We commenced our march again. From this day, I have not been able to keep a daily journal, but nothing much transpired, except the people died daily." The next notable stop along the trail was Fort Bridger, and from Rock Creek Hollow to Fort Bridger is 133 miles. The Willie Handcart Company would make that journey in 10 days. That's averaging about 13 miles per day. Now, along those 133 miles, the company was occasionally met with a few rescuers from Salt Lake, and they had a little bit of food, but mostly a lot of encouragement to have those saints keep moving. Of these occasional meetups with some rescuers along this portion of the trail, John Chislett said, "Near South Pass, we found more brethren from the valley, with several quarters of good fat beef hanging frozen on the limbs of the trees where they were encamped. These quarters of beef were to us the handsomest picture that we ever saw. The statues of Michelangelo or the paintings of the ancient masters would have been to us nothing in comparison to these life-giving pictures." On November 2nd, they arrived at Fort Bridger. Fort Bridger to Salt Lake is 113 miles, still yet to go. But at Fort Bridger, there were many rescuers waiting for them there, with plenty of food, plenty of warm clothing, and plenty of wagons. No one had to walk anymore. Every member of the Willie Handcart Company at this point now had a place in the wagon, and they were able to ride the 113 miles from Fort Bridger to the Salt Lake Valley. On November 9th, 1856, the Willie Handcart Company arrived in the Salt Lake Valley. Since leaving Liverpool, 74 members of the Willie Handcart Company had passed away. When they came into the streets of Salt Lake, there were hundreds of people that came out to greet them. The final entry in the company journal reads this: As soon as the company arrived in the city of Great Salt Lake, the bishops of the different wards took every person that was not provided a home and put them in comfortable quarters. Hundreds of persons were around the wagons on our way through the city, welcoming the company safely home. 6 weeks after arriving in Salt Lake, James Willie, captain of the Willie Handcart Company, was called to be bishop. He would serve for 3 years. Then he would be called to help settle Cache Valley. This is his home in Mendon, Utah. I've got to give credit to my daughter who took this picture for me. He would live here in this home for the last 36 years of his life. During that time, he would serve as mayor for many years, serve in several bishoprics, and as patriarch. Here at the gravesite of James Willie, I'd like to share with you his testimony. This was recorded from a sacrament meeting talk that he gave in 1888, many years after the Handcart Company experience. He said, "Not many in the human family can truly say, 'I know that my Redeemer lives.' Many Latter-day Saints cannot say so because they have not taken the proper course to get this knowledge. It is our privilege to walk in the light that our God has made for us, for He is our guide and our deliverer." President Gordon B. Hinckley, in speaking of the handcart pioneers, said, quote, "We stand today as recipients of their great effort. I hope we are thankful. I hope we carry in our hearts a deep sense of gratitude for all that they have done for us. Our forebears laid a solid and marvelous foundation. Now, ours is the great opportunity to build a superstructure, all fitly framed together with Christ as the chief cornerstone." End of quote. And I say all of these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.